Hello, welcome to the webinar. Bon matin et bienvenue à notre webinaire. Si vous avez besoin de le service d'interprétation, s'il vous plaît, choisir caption en bas de votre écran et sélectionner les options pour avoir la langue de votre choix. If you need interpretation today during the webinar, please go to the bottom of your screen, select captions, and enable Zoom interpretation. Be sure to click on the arrow in the top right corner to select your preferred language of interpretation. Our ongoing Ag Policy webinar series is here to talk about the issues that matter, and we certainly have one of those in front of us today. We pulled this webinar together at the relatively last minute because of, I think, what was ultimately an unexpected outcome, and maybe we'll get some different views on that on Friday, where the ongoing negotiations between Canada and the United States were called off, and Canada chose to suspend the negotiations. We look forward to diving into this today and appreciate our ongoing partnership with RealAgriculture.com that enables us to have and bring these webinars to you today. It was also today's webinar is also made possible by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada funding under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. If you want to find out more about our partnership with Real Agriculture and the ongoing work that we're doing, please go to the realagriculturecanada.com website to sign up for the newsletter and sign up to CAPI's website and subscribe to our mailing list. On the Real Ag website, you can find their policy hub where you'll find columns, past and present, upcoming webinars, policy discussions. You'll be able to see on their website an interview that they've done with Michael Harvey of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance talking about these issues. And you'll be able to go to our website and find some of the reports that we've put out on these issues as well. But if we want to start by hearing from you before we hear from our panelists, and we want to take the opportunity to do a poll that we'll make available to you, really to get your perspective around where we are at today. So if you look on your screen, you will see that a poll will soon pop up, where you will have choices to answer the question. What do you think the Canadian response should be to where we're at today in Canada-U.S. relations? We'll give you a minute to read the options here. They are retaliate and continue to match the U.S. tariffs dollar for dollar. Do not retaliate, but work harder to diversify away from the U.S. Impose export duties on key exports such as potash, a consumer boycott on the U.S., all or some of the above, or none of the above. And while you're thinking about that, I want to take the opportunity to highlight that this October, at the beginning of October in Ottawa, we'll have our annual CAPI Exchange Conference. This year, our focus is on Canadian agriculture and food in a value-added world. I certainly expect that the state of Canada-U.S. relations and our market access to the United States for value-added Canadian agriculture products will be a key theme and topic throughout our 2 days of conversations. So please, their link is in your website. Check that out. Now, Shaun, let's bring you in. I will. I think the results here have gone away. They're back. Shaun, as I hand it over to you, maybe get your thoughts. It looks like 50% of the people that are voted on our poll are looking for all or some of the above in those options.
Yeah, Tyler, kind of not surprising. I think, a lot of Canadians are trying to reconcile, okay, here's where we're at. We know we need to do something in response, but I think we're all kind of struggling on what is the best method to do that. And because you're looking for different outcomes. One, you obviously want both sides back to the table as quickly as possible. But the other part of it is you want the Americans to take notice, to understand that, Canadians are not very happy about some of the things that have been said. I heard yesterday from some members of our American audience weren't very happy with Premier Ford said either. So there is a little bit of back and forth on that. But yeah, those results really don't surprise me. Some of those retaliatory measures are more acceptable. Some are a little bit more controversial, and we'll get into some of the things that we heard from Premier Smith and Premier Moe yesterday on the export tariff idea. So we got lots to discuss here in this webinar.
Great. And I will hand it over to you to get into that in-depth discussion with our first guest today.
Great stuff. Well, our first guest here on the webinar is Lisa Raitt. And I actually had a chance to meet Lisa. Farm Credit Canada hosted a full day event. that was all about Canada-U.S. trade. And it was
Mhm.
great to host a panel that Lisa was a member of, as well as Ralph Goodale, both of them on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council that is dealing with this issue. Lisa, it is great to chat with you.
It was. And you know what? I don't often get to do something with Ralph Goodale sitting next to me. I'm used to Ralph Goodale being on the other side of the house from me and we're arguing about stuff. But on this one, we were pretty much in alignment.
And you've got a lot of experience from the government side. Of course, you were a member of parliament. You also held different ministerial positions, labor, natural resources, as well as transportation, and now at CIBC, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
Um, I guess you're on the inside of this, behind the curtain, in terms of being on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. Tyler mentioned we had Michael Harvey on Real Ag Radio actually yesterday, the executive director at CAFTA, who was also on that.
Yeah.
I guess from your perspective, what happened here? Because both sides have a little bit of a different perspective. Did the U.S. come forward with those last minute changes, or did Canada miscalculate how close they were to a deal here? What's your description of what happened on last Friday?
So honestly, Shaun, I can't say that anything I know is because of what I've heard from the advisory council. The last time we met was the day after the government decided to walk away from the table. And we kind of got the same update that most Canadians got from the prime minister when he addressed the nation. The reality is that I've been hearing lots more since then. You know, I live here in Ontario, so I've been hearing a lot from the Ontario point of view. But I also, as you mentioned, work at CIBC, and we have thousands of clients who are in trade who have we've been talking to over the last couple of days, just trying to get a handle on how all of this is impacting them, not just the Section 338 tariffs or the retaliatory tariffs, but as well the uncertainty around the trade deal. So if I were to go back and say, what do I think happened? From what I can tell from my steel and auto clients, that deal for steel and auto was not workable. And I think they made that known and clear to the premier. And perhaps the premier reported that up. What went on in the machinations of the back and forth, I don't know, but I do know that they felt that the quotas that were being applied to steel would actually strangle the industry moving forward in the future because they would exceed them, and who knew how they were going to actually be able to parse them out amongst everybody. So I'm coming to the conclusion now that perhaps the deal that we thought we had structured in terms of those 232 tariffs wasn't there as strongly or forcefully as what we may have thought at the beginning of the week. At the end of the week, you could see the fact that after Canada may have gone back and asked for some reprieve on those two items, then it kind of degenerated into lots of asks back and forth on things that were tangential, not necessarily the meat of the negotiations, which were very simple. Prevent the 338 tariffs from locking on and try to get some relief on those sectoral 232 tariffs.
Yeah, and if we're not thinking about the trade file on a continual basis, it's easy to get lost in all the different sections here, right?
Yes.
I remember when we were together in Regina at that FCC event, I remember you specifically saying to me, the 232s, those have to be dealt with. And I guess
Yeah.
they haven't been. This, like you just mentioned, they continue to be a roadblock.
They are. What's interesting though is that some of the industry, I can look at steel. They seem to be coping okay with them in the moment. 50% tariff is crazy, but they seem to be able to cope with what's happening in the moment. But certainly, this is not a long-term solve, and definitely getting some relief is super important going forward. I think as well, the reason why I would have said that the sectoral tariffs were important is because Premier of Nova Scotia, sorry, that's my home province, not where I live right now. But the Premier of Ontario said very clearly that he was not going to remove the ban that he had from the Ontario Controlled Liquor Board from buying and purchasing and putting on the shelf American booze unless he was satisfied with the relief on Section 232 tariffs. Now, he said he wanted to get rid of them completely. I don't think that's likely anymore, but I'm sure he was looking at a number. And that's important because one of the preconditions to all of this from the United States, of course, was to get the booze back on the shelves. And not so much because, I mean, Cal Bricker can talk about this better than I can. Maybe not so much from the point of view that it's hurting the economy of the United States, but it was definitely a principle thing.
Yeah, it is gained a lot of headlines in the U.S. I've talked a lot to John Newton, head economist with American Farm Bureau, quite often,
Mm.
and John brings it up as a point. He brings up dairy and he brings up the booze ban, and there had to been a real, there's had to be a period of really explaining to Americans that, this kind of, and how I'm phrasing it this way, kind of a self-inflicted wound. That wasn't, a decision to protect the Canadian industry. That was a decision in retaliation to the 51st state comments that the president was making. Those are two different things.
You are correct. I mean, at the end of the day, maybe it was because of the sectoral 232s, but it was an emotional response, and
Yeah.
it was, being called governor and all that kind of rhetoric that came over at the very beginning of all this. But all that to say that now it's become entrenched, and now it's one of these things that has caused the president to seek to invoke these 338 tariffs, which have never been used before in the history of the nation, and as well, only locked on in Canada. No other country was subject to this.
Yeah, and there's a long, you can lift those booze bans and all the provinces could be back on board, but it's a long tail of demand recovery. And I heard on CBC on Saturday, the Cal's colleague who represents the American wine and spirits industry, recognize that
Yeah.
this is, it's not just about lifting the bans, but it's trying to create that demand long term, which is going to be a bit
John,
of
can
a
I tell you one
challenge.
more thing about the
Yeah,
booze
yeah.
ban that I found really interesting? It was a unifying issue for both Republicans and Democrats in the United States, which I found really interesting. I was speaking to a former congresswoman from California. You don't get bluer than she. I mean, she is definitely Democratic coming from that state, and she didn't understand why we weren't selling California wine. She thought it was silly. So Democrats and Republicans on the same side when it came to this, I guess, retaliation that we carried out in some provinces, not all.
Yeah. What's your personal feeling on the retaliatory tariffs that were announced
Mm.
this week, this dollar for dollar concept? Is it strategy or is it tactic?
Mm, a little bit of both, but I also think it is. I mean, Tyler can tell you that when we went through the same stuff back in the early 2010s, we had the list of retaliatory tariffs ready to go should it proceed to being a real conflict with the United States regarding trade. I think that's the evergreen response from any Canadian government is to propose these. You try to make sure that they're not harmful, that you have the goods that you can actually purchase in Canada so that you're not hurting the Canadian consumer. But it's part of the tool and it is the tactic. The strategy of it, I don't know how much strategy there is involved, quite frankly. And the reason why I say that is I don't know the end sign on all of this. We're not dealing with the normal president of the United States here who doesn't really mind us going into a death spiral on tariffs, it would appear. So we put something on, he's going to put something on. And how far do you go? When does Canada say, Uncle?
You know, I have talked a lot about on our Sirius XM show that's heard by Canadians and Americans. I've talked a lot about this misconception, my opinion, misconception about the midterm results that are going to happen here in November and what that means
Mm.
for Canada's strategy. What is your thought on what changes versus doesn't change post midterms if the Democrats do take the House as expected?
Totally my personal opinion, so take it for what it's worth,
Yep.
which is absolutely nothing. I think the midterms and the results of the midterms have zero impact on what's happening. I don't think it drives the Trump administration back to the table necessarily. I don't think that if there were more Democrats in Congress, for example, they're going to take up the challenge to right the wrongs with respect to trade with Canada. I don't think that's on their top of their agenda items. Probably impeachment is, to be honest, from the way that we can see back and forth how the Congress usually goes in these moments. So no, I mean there's a lot of talk around the midterms, wait till the midterms. I don't buy into any of that. I think we have a real trade issue to deal with, and we've got to deal with the administration. But finally, I would say on all that, from my experience, um, Democrats put things in place and Republicans carry them on, and Republicans put things in place and Democrats carry them on. We've seen that over and over again in our history. And as much as we like to say that, Biden was going to get rid of some of the stuff Trump brought in his first term, he didn't.
He didn't.
He didn't.
The Chinese
And
tariffs, the Section
yeah,
301 tariffs on China, Biden did not
yeah.
remove those.
No, he didn't remove those. And so they're dealing with all of their own politics around this kind of stuff. I will tell you something I'm very interested in the midterms, though, and that is some chatter I heard last night or I read last night about how the Trump administration is thinking about whether or not the president himself is going to do commercials regarding the midterms and really insert himself in some of these cases. And I could imagine that Canada is possibly going to feature in some of those ads about how he's protecting American farmers and American manufacturing from big bad Canada.
He's got his hands full with the American rancher, based on
Oh
the
my
import
gosh,
date.
no
There's
kidding, right?
300,000 metric ton of ground beef coming out of Brazil that's going to end up
Yeah.
in the fast food system. He's got some stuff to handle there with the American rancher, for sure. What's your thought? You know, one of the ideas, and it was in CAPI's poll that they posted at the beginning of the webinar, has to do with these export taxes, an
Mm,
export tariff on key items like Canadian energy and potash. Now, both it happens to be Alberta and Saskatchewan are the focus of those
yeah.
exports. And we heard from the premiers yesterday, they are dead against that idea. What's your
Yeah.
thoughts?
I think Ontario should be very careful about what they wish for, because all you have to do is realize that Line 5 goes through the United States, and that's what takes the oil from the prairies here into Ontario. And the United States can do what it wants to do with a pipeline that's completely within their jurisdiction. Be a shame if it got cut off, right? I mean, they have a big hammer when it comes to some stuff like that. And on potash, we send a lot of Canadian potash out of Portland because we don't have the capacity in Vancouver to do it. So as a result, in both cases, those two commodities rely upon transportation solely through the United States. You start slapping export duties on it, you're hurting yourself first and foremost, but you're opening up a retaliation that could be extraordinarily painful for the Canadian economy. So I think it's okay for Premier Moe and Premier Smith to be cautious about all of it. And if my premier here in Ontario wants to focus on that kind of retaliation, then he should look at his own electricity and hydro.
And just to remind everybody, we have been through these Line 5 issues not too long ago. And Governor
Yeah,
Whitmer in Michigan, who is a Democrat, was talking about that exact issue. Back again, at some point, Republican and Democrat feelings on trade, they kind of connect.
they do. And there was an accident at a Line 5 excavation a couple of nights ago where a transport truck actually fell into a pit where there was excavation. It contacted with the pipe and there was a natural gas leak. I mean, accidents happening like that around time when there's questions of safety and nonsense put out, quite frankly, regarding the safety of Line 5, things could happen that you don't anticipate as a result.
Just to remind everybody that, you know, the reason why potash comes up a lot is that 86% of the potash that is used in the Corn Belt comes
Mm,
from the province of Saskatchewan.
mhm.
And so that's why that is a key focal point, trying to put pressure on the Americans in that regard. We got a question here in the chat.
Oh,
Appreciate,
cool.
yeah,
I love
Larry.
that.
Larry has a great question. It's regarding the section, he says 332, but I think 338 tariffs regarding, it's the Smoot-Hawley Act, which is
Yep,
going
that's right.
way back in time.
That's right.
There is expected that the courts are going to decide if the Trump administration can actually use it as a tool.
Correct.
This
Yeah.
is the tool they used on Friday when they applied the 50% tariffs. Uh, is I guess that's a card that Canada, but that's a long haul waiting for the Supreme Court to rule on the Smoot-Hawley Act.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up, Larry. The reality is that we'd have to go through the process of the United States. It'd have to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is a little bit more political in the United States than it is here in Canada, and as a result, you may not know which way that's going to go. But the interesting thing, if you do a little digging on the actual law around this act, um, it's never been litigated before, so we don't have any precedents, but it also is extremely powerful. And it's not clear that you have to go to Congress in order to utilize the power in this act. And it may very well be uh, quite the applicable power of the President of the United States. And getting that ruling, I think it's a little horrifying because that puts a huge weapon in the hands of any president in any administration because they can claim discrimination on anything and then turn around and tariff something not even closely related to the discriminatory claim as punishment. And that's what's happening here. Complain about cows and cars and cocktails, but you're going to tariff everything else.
it's legislative scope creep, right? Where
It
it's dealing with
unified,
a issue
yeah,
and you're able to expand it to a whole bunch of other issues.
that is correct. It's the unified theory for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I've heard just following the media news cycle around all this, I've heard a number of different analysts say, I'm glad that talks were called off and this ended because
Hmm.
we would have compromised on some issues and then there would be the next thing. And so Canada needs to focus on and the Prime Minister used this in his address on Saturday. He used the word comprehensive quite a bit, which is not talking
Mm,
about sectoral negotiations. It's more looking at the entire blanket of agreement. What's your thoughts on that?
yeah. So the way it was explained to us on the advisory council was step one is to prevent the 338 tariffs from locking on to the goods. Step two was trying to get relief on those 232 sectorals. Step three was try to come to some agreement on the bigger picture items, the stuff the United States wanted. They wanted critical minerals. They wanted to have some discussion on defense. They wanted to have discussions on sovereignty in the North, the dome and all that kind of stuff. But then the final one was, can we get a path back to negotiating CUSMA because the United States still has some outstanding issues with our free trade agreement that is still, percolating along underneath all of these skirmishes. And there is hope that we get into a process of being able to get to some kind of conclusion on elongating the time and the term of this agreement. But all of that has gone to the wayside because we couldn't get through the first two steps.
So one of the things that the Prime Minister said on Saturday was one of the U.S. requests was or demands, however you want to phrase that, had to do with Canada's ability to talk about FTAs with
Hmm.
other nations.
Yeah.
Um, I would like some clarity on whether that was really about China or that was about other countries, because again, those may be two different things. But there is in the current CUSMA agreement, there are
Exactly.
lines about being able to do trade deals with non-market economies, which again really talks about that's really about China. So
Yeah.
is this a new thing or what's going on here?
Well, you said I'd like some clarity. I would love some clarity around that one. That and the language requirements and the attack of the culture. I don't know what was underneath those. Unfortunately, we're getting a he said from either, Jameson Greer on one side and Dominic LeBlanc on the other. I would really like to know exactly what it was that the Americans asked that was a bridge too far. I think that would be important. But you're right. In CUSMA, as it is right now, Justin Trudeau negotiated a clause that said that before we get into any trade agreements with non-market economies, China, that we would have to go well, the United States would have the ability to say whether or not they liked it or something along. I'm
Yes, yeah.
paraphrasing, but that's the gist of it. They get a call on it. I think the one ask that I narrowed in on as something that was really problematic for me was the fact that the U.S. clearly said, and they've disclosed this themselves, that if they reserve the right to snap back those 338 tariffs and apply them themselves, should they not be happy with the way Canada dealt with immigration policy or defense policy or fentanyl or any of those irritants that they brought up before. And that to me is a greater pull on our sovereignty than anything else. You don't want to have the United States sitting out there and judging what's happening in the House of Commons and determining whether or not they're going to slap some tariffs on to punish us. I think that is the bridge too far on sovereignty. And on that alone, I would walk away.
Okay. From your perspective, how quickly is it possible to get back to the table? Because there's advantages to the walk away, which is you can kind of do a bit of a reset. Okay, let's start fresh again. Because in the the our trade negotiators were there throughout the weekend, throughout the week. These were intense
Mhm.
talks without question. How quickly can we get back to the table?
If you
And
asked
what
me this
triggers that?
question, yeah, if you asked me this question yesterday afternoon, I would have said we're waiting a long time. Then Minister LeBlanc puts out a nice little soft email or a nice little soft post on social media saying along the lines of, well, let's try to work to get back to the table. So quite frankly, Shaun, I'm confused. I don't know whether or not we're trying to get back to the table or not trying. And that's where we need to seek the clarity again from the government in terms of where we stand in the whole piece. But I will tell you this, I know something that we talk about here at CIBC. We've met with thousands of clients. The relationship managers have been out there talking to clients more so than the actual impacts of 338 tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs. What really concerns business is uncertainty.
Yeah.
And the uncertainty of whether or not we have CUSMA going forward. They're holding back on making decisions on investment. They're holding back on business plans. They're holding back on development. And it's not only the industries that get impacted because they're going to have to shut down. It's the industries that are kind of impacted that are taking the decision not to build that we're losing as well. And our economists are taking a look at what's happening right now. And, that big R word recession is going to start getting thrown around the longer this goes.
Yeah, here's the reality and I don't know about Mexico. I'm assuming it would probably, let's just assume it's the same. But in both Canada and the U.S., the number one concern right now for consumers is affordability. Well, what has transpired here in the last 2 weeks is not fixing affordability. And so there's some political ramifications the longer this goes on for both President Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney.
I think so. Whether or not it manifests, Mr. Carney right now, though, enjoys such a popularity across the country. I feel sometimes that he can be prime minister as long as he wants to, quite frankly. The politics of this are definitely in his favor. And it's very difficult, I think, for the opposition to launch any kind of criticism because they're being seen as criticizing Canada as opposed to criticizing, the path that the government is choosing to take. And there's lots of criticism you can make about the path that they're choosing to take, but we need to know what that path was. And I hope that we will get some more information from the tables.
I've said in U.S. media a lot that, what you need to understand is, President Trump's ratings continue to drop and have kind of hit a bit of a, kind of a baseline. In both Mexico and Canada, the more they push back, the higher the approval rating goes. And that is not working in favor of having some sort of quick deal. Although Prime Minister Carney was elected for this specific issue, there is no doubt about it. You mentioned getting back to the table and some of the comments from Trade Minister LeBlanc. USTR Ambassador Jameson Greer was on CBC, did that interview. I thought it was a positive that he did that interview, by the way.
Yeah.
But he said there's currently no open communication channels with Canada. So we'll have to see if those two sides kind of the messaging gets a little bit more in line.
Yeah.
Take that for
I would say that there's no formal open communications. Every government has lots of tentacles across the border that have to happen. Even may not be in trade, but I can tell you that the egg people are talking to one another.
If you've watched The Diplomat on Netflix, there's always a back channel. There's always a back channel, Lisa.
Great show, but I wish she'd brush her hair. That's all. That's all I got to say about that.
It's a little all over the place.
Very unkempt.
One of the words that has come up a lot is transparency. We're hearing a lot of Canadians saying, okay, understand why you walked away, but we would like to hear more about this. Would it be an advantage if the Canadian government was more open or like, here's exactly where we're at and explain so that it maybe solidifies this walk away a little bit more? What are your thoughts on the transparency argument?
I think if there's any weakness in how the government has managed the situation right now, it's been on the communication side. And they are really tying the hands of anybody who is at the table or who are around the negotiations to be able to come out and say, look, this is what happened. I think they can do it in response to what the United States is saying. I mean, we're getting our information from the New York Times and the Washington Post and from the Wall Street Journal and from Jameson Greer and doing all of the Sunday morning political shows in the United States. And we're not really getting it. We got one speech from the Prime Minister. We got some language when there were supports announced the other day, but very, very high level and general in nature and kind of giving you a piece of information, but not the whole part. There are some sectors, though, Shaun, who know a lot what's going on. They understand what was at the table, and maybe that's appropriate. But right now, Canadians aren't really calling for more information or transparency, and that is just a sign of the fact that I believe the majority of Canadians are fully behind the Prime Minister and this government in terms of how to manage Donald Trump and his administration when it comes to trade. Whether or not that holds over time, I don't know.
We're going to pass it back to Tyler here in a second, but final question from Myrna in the chat, and I'm just going to alter it a little bit, Myrna. But as this goes on, Lisa, what advice do you have to Canadian farmers and ranchers and winemakers in terms of anything they should be doing or thinking about, like
Yeah.
trying to get through this because of this uncertainty you're talking about?
Okay, two things. First of all, if you have any connections and contacts and clients on the other side of the border, please do encourage them to let their congressperson or their senator or their legislative representative know that the Canada is so important to their own economic well-being, and that a quicker resolution to this is far preferable than something going on for years and years and years. The second thing that I would advise, just domestically, is talk to your lender, talk to, if it's Farm Credit Corp or Farm Canada Corp, sorry, FCC. I'm used to acronyms. I'm from
Yeah.
Ottawa, my bad.
Yeah.
Or if it's your bank, talk to your relationship manager, figure out what's going on. There's programming available from the Canadian government that may be of help. And if it's not of help, then you should definitely tell somebody that they need to have a better program in place. And the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Confederation of Agriculture, all those places, like just keep everybody informed, because the government is a very broad and large instrument and they don't always get it right. And the voices have to get in there to make sense. So, call up Tyler McCann and tell him what's going on as well. He'll put his
Yeah.
number up later for you, I'm sure.
Yeah. If you have good things to say, you can email me. If you have arguments and grievances, please email
Tyler.
Tyler.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too.
You mentioned acronyms. I interviewed somebody from Farm Credit Canada, FCC. Of course, in the U.S., that means a whole different acronym. And I had an email from somebody saying, "Why are you talking to somebody at the FCC about agricultural issues?" So acronyms can be confusing. Hey, Lisa, thanks so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate your perspective, and all the best to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.
Great stuff. Hey, that's Inside the Curtain, Tyler. She is on the advisory council, providing great perspectives, very connected to some of the industries that are most contentious here: steel, aluminum, and autos. So here we go.
And such a good reminder that so many of these issues, again, we probably feel them very strongly in the ag sector, but they are much issues beyond agriculture. But Lisa made a point, very true. We do like to hear from people. If you always want to reach out, please get in touch. But we have another poll that we're going to put up so we can hear from you, the audience, on this. And that's really about, what are the impacts going to be on Canadian agriculture and food? What do you think that those biggest impacts will be? Is it about increased equipment and input costs, tighter margins for farmers because of these tariffs that are going back and forth? Is it about the reduced sales and prices for products that are being hit by the tariffs? This general decreased investment that was talked about, the uncertainty, the impacts that are there. Is it that impacts will actually be limited? Are we overplaying thinking about this? Or is the idea that ultimately tariffs are not going to last long, or going to be even fully implemented, and the impacts will be limited because of that? So take a minute, answer that question, and that'll set up our next phase as we get into the next panel discussion. Shaun, maybe over to you. What would you answer on this poll here? What do you think the impacts are going to be?
Probably I would say I would be concerned about number one. Costs are a huge concern for farmers. I think, we'd heard the Prime Minister say on Saturday about farm machinery, and Kelvin Hepner from RealAgriculture, he went like through all 2,400 tariff codes in that retaliation list, and farm machinery was a little less mentioned than maybe we thought it was going to be. That was encouraging, but I think at a time where profitability is a concern for farmers, we've seen the market come up, but there's also a lot of concern about costs right now, and tariffs are a tax on the person paying, and that is a concern, I think, for farmers. So I would choose number one.
Yeah, and 49% of those that answered the poll chose number one as well. Clearly, that's top of mind for our audience.
Tyler, on the export tax, to Lisa's point about just be careful what you wish for. Yes, Canada sends a lot of potash to the U.S. We also get a lot of phosphorus out of America, and so let's be careful what we wish for. This is the challenges with trying to come up with something that makes a point, but doesn't create a whole bunch of other consequences that escalated out of line. So I'm going to stop talking, Tyler, pass it off to you, and get on with the rest of our show. Great.
And so we are now going to bring in our first mini panel, are Al and Cal. Al is a senior research fellow at CAPI, also a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, and is the research lead and founder of Agri-Food Economic Systems. Cal is the CEO of Spirits Canada, and has got 30 years of experience across regulated sectors, and is affiliated with the Monk School and others. Really, what we want to do is dive into what does this really mean for some of the sectors that are impacted. And Al, we'll start with you on this. You've put out a couple of papers recently looking at the potential impacts on U.S. demands on Canadian dairy, specifically around dairy TRQ administration. But ultimately, despite all of the noise and kind of the media focus on this, it seems like dairy was something that had been pretty easily agreed to. Al, first, were you surprised to hear that dairy was settled? It seems relatively easily in this dispute. And if we had had an agreement, what was your work telling you about what would have been the impact of the changes that the Americans were looking for?
Yeah, Tyler, it's kind of odd how little has been said about this. We haven't heard very much about it. I guess we're left by default to suppose that this was agreed to, the changes in TRQ administration that the U.S. had requested. Based on the work that I do, I think this would be costly for the Canadian dairy industry. From a couple of different perspectives. First of all, the TRQs for dairy products that are in demand in Canada, which are cheese, butter, cream, etc., they're already filled. So when they're already filled, well, why care about the TRQ administration? I think the reason to care is that the U.S. interest is to export to Canada as high a valued product as possible. And I think they thought that if they could get more influence over that by allocation to retailers, that would benefit them. Well, if you have more of the volume can change, it's filled, but if it's oriented more towards premium products, presumably that presents a prospect that some of the Canadian premium dairy products will be chased out of that space, which is a loss to Canadian dairy processors. I think the bigger issue, so that's a loss to Canadian processors. It also presents some challenges from a competitive dynamic perspective. We worry about the competitive dynamic between grocery retailers and their suppliers. And we have a grocery code of conduct and a national food strategy that's addressing some of those issues. But the other, perhaps bigger issue is that the allocation system of raw milk from the farm it's regulated on a use it or lose it basis to the processing plant. So if you've got a processing plant that has been selling premium product to the retail segment that loses some of that business, if they don't want to if they don't want to go back and produce some lower level kind of product and they start to phase down their volumes, well then that's a loss of milk allocation, and that has to be reconfigured somehow or other. So that's so there's really three aspects of it that I think create costs.
And it's worth probably being clear that we knew that this was an issue, right? We've had two dispute panels between Canada and the U.S. and customs in it. Worth highlighting, that's the value of trade agreements because they give you dispute settlement mechanisms. And I think one of the challenges that we had, right, was that it was a draw, arguably on the first panel. We won, arguably, on the second panel. But it was because they weren't able to resolve these issues through the dispute settlement mechanism that they were looking for these other changes at the end of the day, right?
Well, one of the concerns that I think comes up here is specifically with the Section 338 tariffs. The president said, well, look, you're gonna allocate the TRQs to our satisfaction, or else. But wait a minute. The dispute resolution mechanism within the CUSMA agreement, which was, as I think everybody knows, that was negotiated under the first Trump administration, and at the time was the best trade deal ever negotiated. That was resolved under that dispute mechanism, so legally. Well, I mean, when the president can come in with essentially a political measure to override the legal dispute resolution mechanism, I go back to something that Lisa said here just a few minutes ago with the apparent intent of the administration to fall back on Section 338 as sort of the stick for any and all issues. I mean, I don't know how you negotiate a durable arrangement with somebody who's prepared to do that.
Well, and that is, I think, well, I'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about the future. Let's bring Cal into the discussion. Cal, as much as supply management's been in the news and the media, Canadian or U.S. alcohol is banned very much front and center. Before we look to the future, I'm curious, what's the last year been like in the Canadian spirits industries? We've seen demand for U.S. products go down. This opportunity that's there, and you've been in the news so much. What's the last year been like?
Thanks so much for having me on. We consider ourselves to be a pretty significant agricultural product in Canada. I think I mentioned in discussions earlier that we produce $2 billion of spirits in Canada, and $1 billion of it is sold in the U.S. So it's 93% of our exports. So this is a very significant issue for us. Another thing sort of a preface in the answer to the answer is, this notion that you can target a company in a country in trade agreements is kind of an anachronism. I mean, when you look at something like the spirits business, global spirits business, you pick a company like, I'll just pick Suntory, which is one of my members. They have Alberta Distilling Limited, so Canadian Club and a number of other products. They own Maker's Mark, Kentucky Bourbon. They own a number of tequila brands. So it's one balance sheet that manages the whole business. So if you're retaliating against Maker's Mark, who are you actually retaliating against? Yourself. So we have that situation to deal with. So yes, the last year has been pretty fraught. I mean, there were a bunch of headwinds that we were facing anyway in terms of changes that were experienced in the market. There's probably been more change in the last 3 years in the spirits business in Canada than there's been in 100. So there's been a lot to manage in terms of new points of sale and all these other kinds of things. Plus, just declining spirits volumes internationally. We're feeling the same things in Canada. Affordability is a big challenge. So all of those things come to play into this issue. One thing I will say is the Canadian government and our colleagues in the United States and Mexico have been great to deal with on all of this. I know there's been a complaint about transparency. I'll just say that there's just like a labor negotiation, there's many tables. The public tables and then the private tables, and we've been pretty heavily involved in a lot of the discussions that have been going on. So I'm happy to talk about any of that if there's an interest. But our interest right now is really to try and get people back to the table. I'm maybe a little more sanguine than we've heard about the prospects of that. I can tell you, I've been talking to Canadian officials all this week. And one of the things they said to me, which I thought was encouraging, was that in a lot of negotiations, you see, doors being slammed and fists on table. There was none of that in this. So there's not a lot of personal stuff to fix. In fact, Jameson Greer was at the Canadian Embassy on the weekend for the Indy race. I mean, so I think that there's an interest in getting everybody back. They need to blow some steam off for the next bit. And I think we'll find ourselves, I hope, back at the table, because for reasons we all know, this needs to get solved.
Right, and I think there's a good reminder of history, right? When you look at the Mulroney negotiations in the late 80s, that he pulled his negotiating team and effectively suspended negotiations prior to getting the original.
I wanted to comment on that because, I don't think that that's getting widely enough reported, and this is just conjecture. But you've been around in this long enough. All three of us have. I mean, I was involved in all the Clinton negotiations in the late 80s, early 90s. So there was a lot of this stuff going on. And for people that think that Trump is actually different in terms of some of the stuff that he's doing, not really. It's very similar to what was going on there. Creation of deadlines, pushing people up against them to try and get some concessions. And Section 3, the 338 stuff, people feel like that's new. Well, they can do the same thing under Section 301 if they want to. I mean, there's lots of mechanisms to apply pressure to us on us if they want to. I think that what we're going to see going on is a lot of this stuff is driven by domestic politics. One of the reasons spirits have been chosen, liquor boards have been chosen, is because people see it right? And there's not much else, frankly, the provinces have to retaliate with. So we're gonna see some more of that kind of thing. That's why Scott Moe did it. You know, the 50% tariff yesterday. What else has he got? He's not going to do anything with potash. They've also got to deal with the referendum in Alberta. There's an election in Quebec. I mean, so there's a lot of stuff flying around here, and it all comes to play in this. So, I mean, back to the prime minister. At some point, he had to do something to show that he just wasn't accepting every demand that was being made. And I mean, I think he was going to be tested in terms of the provinces implementing what he was looking to get, and keeping Canada together seamlessly. So probably wasn't a bad move. Anybody that was advising him politically would say, people are with you one way or the other. This is a good way to demonstrate that we got the best deal down the road. The next one, whatever it is that we were able to get. So there's a lot of that stuff flying around right now, and my hope again though is that we get back to the table and get this over the line.
And so if you think though, looking ahead, kind of beyond the particular negotiations, getting back to the table, one of the things that the Prime Minister said on Saturday in his remarks, that he said over and over again over the last couple of years, is that Canada can give itself more than the Americans can take away. But to pick up on something you said earlier, Cal, you produce $2 billion worth of spirits. You export $1 billion of them. I'm guessing we would all be in pretty rough shape if we tried to drink that $1 billion of spirits that's going to the United States today. What do you think about the solution to this? How do you kind of think about the potential for interprovincial trade barriers to get fixed, for us to kind of grow the market that way to offset potential negative impacts as Canadian spirit exports end up on retaliatory tariff lifts? And
Yeah, I think the interprovincial barriers thing. It's a bit like the direct to consumer thing, that sort of got a lot of media in the last couple of weeks. Is people that are talking about it generally don't understand the business very well, and don't understand that this rhetoric is sort of tied up in a business model that existed in the 90s that doesn't exist anymore. So there was a requirement back then, by the way, and to remind people of having a brewery in every province that you wanted to sell beer in. Well, that doesn't exist and hasn't existed for a long time. The truth is, in terms of interprovincial barriers and direct to consumer, there's not really much of that going on. It's not a real big barrier to my guys sell anywhere they want to in the country. Now, some craft players, I understand it's more of a challenge. But again, we're 70% of the business in the country, and it's not a big barrier for us. But I'll say, I mean, the direct-to-consumer piece, I mean, was an iconically inexplicable thing. Nobody could really understand why you couldn't do that. So it sort of stood out there as something that everybody could point to, that there was, all this interprovincial trade barrier stuff going on in the country. Well, once they got rid of this, you have a hard time getting to what's next. And I know, like Trevor Tombe and others have said, there's $2 billion wrapped up in interprovincial barriers in the country. You'll have to show me, because I don't see it. Unless provinces are willing to give up their environmental assessments and a whole bunch of other things that I'm pretty sure they're not going to want to, and that they actually have constitutional authority over, it's hard to imagine that that's going to change all that much.
and I think that's our work certainly kind of points to some similar points there as well. But so Al, kind of when we think about kind of what we could do, how do we respond to this? Where do we go forward? You've looked a lot at trade markets, potential opportunities that are there. What do you see as the opportunity for Canadian agriculture and food to move that business away from the United States today, diversify to somewhere else? How real of a thing is this?
I think first, just to pick up on what Cal was telling us here a moment ago, we have a crisis. Let's not waste it. We've got some work on productivity. I'm not going to say anything that's particularly new here, but we've got work on productivity, and badly needed work. I think Trevor Tombe and another colleague had a piece from McDonald-Laurier Institute the other day, and they were talking about this and putting some metrics around it. So that's a really important piece. Look, we have a challenge here. First of all, to some degree, we're fragmented provincially in this country, and that impacts our scale in some areas. But look, we're a population of 40 million people. we're not a mass producer of really anything. I mean, maybe we're a mass producer of canola and wheat. Well, actually, we're a mass exporter. We're not even a mass producer of those things. That, along with everything else, we're gonna be challenged to have scale. So we're export players, but we don't deal in the mass volumes that really get the unit cost down, et cetera. So these are all sort of unique situations that we can go to work on. Again, this isn't a new problem. It's just highlighted by the crisis that we're in today. And on that, we've been talking about tariffs as part of retaliation. Premier Eby, I saw some remarks he made talking about non-tariff issues, and I think he was talking about coal trains into the port of Vancouver, and I'm forgetting at the moment what the other point was that he raised. But look, going back to milk, you wanted me to talk about dairy a little bit. We have a situation with the U.S. in which they have a different set of standards for milk quality from which fluid and manufactured dairy products are made than Canada has, and it's at some level that's not particularly a problem. We have a codex system internationally that we work with and allows for some of these things, but we're not looking to find new points of conflict with the U.S. Our differences, by not exploiting them, that's sort of a way to build goodwill or kind of good relationships on a mass balance basis. But now we're confronted with a situation in which it seems like there's no goodwill to build here. Well, look, last year, the U.S. decided to stop funding through the Food and Drug Administration the accreditation process for the labs that do all the milk testing. Well, look, I mean, this is a food safety issue. It's a food quality issue, but it's a food safety issue. And there's also a significant proportion of milk production in the U.S. which would exceed the level of milk production of the Atlantic provinces that doesn't even meet that standard. We don't know what it is. Are we importing it? Well, we don't know. And look, I think, where we're engaged with the U.S., we have an opportunity to come in and say, well, look, we're going to talk about tariffs. Let's have a look at your milk quality standards here. This is an issue for us, something we can make progress on.
And it certainly seems like if you go back to kind of what we've seen with alcohol, it is that's not a retaliatory tariff or an export tax. That is arguably kind of creative retaliation that's had an impact. I think that's not something that maybe gets talked often enough about what other more creative options that are there. But I want to start to kind of wrap up the session with driving deeper on the question of value added. Again, it's something that we're quite quite keen on. It's our conference is in October. We'll look at this. I expect Craig Johnston from FCC will want to talk about this again after. But we've got a question from the panel. Why doesn't Canada invest in transforming more of our raw products here? It's a long time project, but we have to do it. And maybe, Cal, I will go back to you on this because, again, spirits producers, distillers, you transform those products, but you're still export dependent for those transformed products that are there. We've heard about uncertainty earlier. How do you think about this? What are some lessons that we can learn from the spirits experience around adding value to our raw products and how that plays out in a trade war like we're in right today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things that we should make reference to is the GIs. So you can't make Canadian whiskey anywhere except Canada. You can't make American whiskey, largely bourbon, in anywhere except the United States, and you can't make tequila except in Mexico. Now you can ship bulk and bottle it in different places, but the actual distillation has to occur in that place to get those designations, which is an important thing. And it offers a couple of advantages. One is you can't replace the product. So Kentucky bourbon, we can't create it here. But they can't recreate Canadian whiskey, which is an important thing because there's this assumption that we import this river of burden and we don't export anything to the United States. The truth is, we export 12 times more in volume, 3 times more in revenue to the United States than we bring in, which is the opposite of what most people think. And if you could produce it cheaper, and there's a good chance you probably could in the United States, you may do that, but you can't because we have these GIs in place. And that means that we look to our farmers, and anybody that's a grain farmer here knows this, that we're the biggest purchasers of the highest value grains that Canadian farmers produce. So a lot of that stuff in the supply chain and grossing up to the products that we sell here has a huge impact on the agricultural community. And we've got mechanisms and structures in place and legal protections in place to continue that. So those are the kinds of things we think about. You might have seen in the last while, we worked with Dale Nally and the folks in Alberta and our craft colleagues to create an Alberta Whiskey Act, so that three quarters of the grains that are used in those whiskeys there will be Alberta whiskeys, or will be Alberta grains. Sorry, and we're going to there'll be a tourism component to it. There'll be a bunch of other things. Those are the kinds of things we're looking to try and do to really try to enhance the value of our products.
But Kel, so you talk about enhancing the value of your products. If you put $1 billion U.S. market at risk, how much of an offset is that enhancement of the value of those products?
Oh, minimal. I mean, like my concern is really post the trade disputes. I mean, like we're in a situation that's I won't say it's sui generis, but pretty close. In the sense of, this is kind of unprecedented at this level for it to go on. I can't ever recall a situation where we banned the sale of U.S. alcohol in this country. I can't recall a situation where there was a 50% tariff. Now, we did have, in the 90s, there was retaliation and counter-retaliation on the beer side, but nothing that was even close to what we're dealing with right now. So my hope is that what happens is we get through this piece, and I believe we will, and I believe it will be in a relatively, I'll define what short term is, but I think it's not going to be as intractable as people think, because it just makes too much sense to get it sorted out, and I think we will. And coming out of the other end of that, we're doing a lot of things in the Canadian spirits business right now to make sure that we're actually building our capacity here in the country.
And so I will give the last word on this to you. Cal seems optimistic in short term that this gets resolved. What's your sense as to what the future holds?
Well, I think the person asking the question is correct in terms of the opportunity and need to do more value adding in Canada. But look, there's some pretty potent challenges here, and to me the essential challenge that we face in Canadian ag and food is we are not mass producers, yet at the same time we have productive capacity that greatly extends beyond our population of domestic consumers to feed. So we're at imminent threat of overproduction. So that's why, one way to look at it is, on how do you handle that? On one hand, for some commodities, particularly that are perishable and at special threat of market leverage by the downstream segments, you supply manage them. In others, you have to work very hard to get export market access for those products. So out of that milieu, somehow we have to be able to figure out how to operate with efficient value-adding activities that are not going to be able to operate at scale and have the same low level of unit cost as some of our competitors, particularly our American competitors. They have a much larger production system and a much larger population of people to feed.
Al, quickly, how optimistic are you that this gets resolved in the relatively near term?
Well, I'm going to do the economic forecasters thing. Is you don't forecast both an outcome and a time. I really like what I hear people saying is that this won't last long. I sure hope they're right. I mean, I don't want to go too much into the political side where which isn't my expertise, but the difficulty is that President Trump needs an off ramp or needs to be seen as somehow winning this. And if he sticks to what he's asking for, I don't see how we allow for that. So call me cautiously optimistic, but I don't know that this gets resolved as quickly as perhaps some other people are thinking. Now, our counter tariffs don't come in place till September 8th. We're already making some interim changes to it. This morning I read that fish, which apparently the industry was surprised to have fish put on the retaliation list. The fish has been now removed. So maybe there's some jockeying that will occur there, but yeah, I worry that this could last a while, and we should, at a minimum, we should be prepared for that, and then pleasantly surprised if we can get resolved quickly.
Great. Well, that is a good note to segue on to our last panel. I'd like to thank Cal Bricker from Spirits Canada and Al Mussell from Agri-Food Economic Systems for joining us. Now we'll get into, I guess, our economist corner and get into some of that forecasting. I'd like to introduce Joe Glover. Joe, thank you for joining us today. Joe spent his career, he's now a senior research fellow emeritus at IFPRI and has held senior roles at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including chief economist there. And Craig Johnson is the chief economist at Farm Credit Canada. He serves as their key spokesperson on agriculture, food, and the broader economy. He previously worked at the Bank of Canada and held economic positions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at the University of Victoria. Welcome, Craig and Joe. Thank you both for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks.
So Craig, let's start with you. We're going to go to actually a question from the chat here from the audience. Question is, how does this 50% tariff affect our stocks and bonds market? Will there be any spillover? And if yes, will that spillover be immediate or occur over time? And will the Bank of Canada review prime rates? So let's start with you on that.
This is a really important issue that's kind of lurking in the shadows, not just for Canada, for the United States. I'm really glad that somebody put this in the chat. I actually have heard some great headlines in the news recently that there's, in fact, 3 players at the negotiating table right now. There's Canada, the United States, and actually the U.S. bond market. And the importance of this is real, right? And we've actually seen the United States, in my opinion, and many other economists' opinion, actually, the Trump administration, concede to some extent in terms of concerns over rising bonds, rising debt levels. We saw this back during Liberal Day tariffs and the days that followed, where bond markets did spike in reaction to the tariff news that came out. And in fact, we did see that announcement from the U.S. administration that they had a deal. We saw a 2-day, 3-day pause until Friday at midnight, and we actually saw intervention by the U.S. Treasury. So a lot of evidence suggesting that they were in fact looking at the bond market and carefully treading there. For most countries, rising bonds is kind of an annoyance. For the United States right now, unfortunately, it's actually critically important. $40 trillion debt level, 125% of GDP. You look at the numbers in terms of debt interest payments daily, 3.8 billion is the last number I saw. That's actually more than what's being paid on Medicare and defense. So this is a huge issue for them. It's typically what mortgage rates are being priced off of. 10 years, usually the benchmark, but 30 years, kind of the one that's in the headlines right now. 5.2% on the 30-year in the U.S., highest since 2007. Of course, we probably remember what happened in 2008 and 2009. The global financial crisis, therefore, thereafter took over. This is a big issue right now. And I'm thinking that, again, this is going to be something that's going to be a watch item for the U.S. administration in these negotiations. Now, how does this relate to us? Now, fortunately and unfortunately, the North American bond markets are highly correlated. So as mortgages and loans are given within Canada and the United States, they're paid for through issuing bonds. And and that's the case in Canada too. So the Canadian bond market is highly integrated with the U.S. bond market. Our bonds are also treading in similar directions. And that is immediately translating to higher costs of capital, even though the Bank of Canada has not revised rates. We always look at the overnight lending rate as, what was the Bank of Canada's decision? Where are they going to go? That's going to determine whether I go a variable or fixed mortgage, for example. Well, in fact, those rates are already changing despite no change from the Bank of Canada. So this is a big watch item right now for me.
Okay, I appreciate that. Joe, maybe I want to take a step back, because I think something that we don't often appreciate in Canada is the state of the U.S. farm economy. How do you describe how things are in U.S. agriculture, and what impact does is the broader kind of trade agenda of the United States government playing into the farm economy today in the U.S.?
Yeah, no, I think there's no question the trade economy or the trade policies have really kind of had significant impacts on U.S. agriculture, particularly the crop side. But if you look at in general, farm income levels actually in the aggregate have been quite high. They've been quite high because the federal government has poured massive amounts of money into the sector. I mean, I was looking at 2026 and just the USDA numbers that come out. I think it was something like $55 billion going into the sector. And that includes crop insurance, that includes all the standing farm bill programs. But on top of that, these massive subsidy programs that have come in, for a variety of reasons, but trade is one of them. And despite we go back to the 2018-19 trade war with China, that really hit a lot of agricultural commodities pretty hard, with the exception of when we were coming out of COVID, when we had those really high grain prices. They've been and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Those prices have come down considerably since then, and I think the crop side has really struggled hard. So farmers look at crop receipts, they look at which have been low, they look at input costs which have been high. I mean, these are the same factors Canadian farmers look at as well. But what has kept them going has been these big payments, and so I think that has been a huge issue. And if you look at the major indicators like gross or net farm income or land values or any of those things, they look great, but farmers look right down the road and say, well, what happens if these payments don't continue? Where will we be? And I think the underlying fundamentals, particularly on the crop side, and we've seen ag prices come up a bit over the last 3 months, 4 months, with both Hormuz and then what's renewed fighting or renewed difficulties in the Black Sea and other things that have brought a lot of the grain prices up a bit. But still, I think that they're struggling with high input costs that have not been helped by U.S. policies and other sorts of things.
And so, Craig, we'll come to you in a minute, but Joe, staying on this theme around support, I think one of the things that we've heard our Prime Minister say is that the Canadian government will support impacted sectors and help them get through this. Again, I think today we're not seeing huge direct impact on agriculture, but depending on how this drags on, we may see that. What lessons, Joe, should we be learning from the experience of the U.S. agriculture with these very large direct payments around what's the right way to support or not support a sector that's going through changes like this?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any good lessons to learn from it. I mean, these have been very imperfect, right? I mean, they're blanket payments that Congress has passed, and in some cases, in other cases, the administration has used obscure budget provisions that allow them to give supplemental aid when farmers are hurting. And as a consequence, I think the criticism that a lot of people would leverage is that there's some that haven't been helped enough, and others have been helped too much. Too much is the wrong word, but in the sense of what's worrisome is just the classic argument about subsidies is they'll distort decisions and other sorts of things over the long run. And you want to make sure whatever you're doing with payments is that you're not encouraging farmers to ignore market signals. And I think that I fear with even though a lot of these payments, frankly, are relatively decoupled in the sense there's still, massive amounts of money that are going. And don't get me wrong, I understand why. It's you have to be sympathetic if someone's ripped out a market from under you. But it's, as I've said in the past, it's a bit of a moral hazard for the government. It allows them to do anything. Allows the bull to go through the china shop if someone's following the bull with a big checkbook, saying, "Don't worry about this."
And Craig, we've seen some of that commentary in the Canadian context as well, where the government's willingness to come in and support impacted sectors makes it a little bit easier for them to be bolder. But maybe I'm curious as to kind of what your thinking is today around the likely impact of kind of the trade war as it unfolds, the tariffs, the retaliatory tariffs, the other spin-off impacts. What is that likely impact on agriculture and food?
Yeah, I mean that's the question right now. Like anytime we see tariffs and these retaliatory tariffs put in place, there's going to be impacts. These supply chains are highly integrated across North America for good reason, and we've benefited from those for decades. So we should expect impacts, and this can come through higher input costs, equipment and packaging specifically for the agri-food sector, ingredients. I think we've heard from a few folks already. I think Lisa was the first to comment on this. One big watch item for me right now is really investment. So this uncertainty that we're living in right now, this isn't necessarily specific to the ag and agri-food sector. It's specific to all sectors of the economy, but I think we're in a real inflection point in the ag and food sector in terms of being able to capitalize on growing food demand and increasing appetite for diversification globally. I think there's a strong opportunity in front of Canada to capitalize on that, but it's going to require investment. And right now, my biggest concern is just the uncertainty that we're in right now over the past couple of years with what tariff is. Is it 232, IEPA? Is it the 301, the 122s? Is it the recent 338s? We're in a world of tariffs right now, it seems, between, unfortunately, the two countries, Canada and the United States. And that is having an effect on business investment in both countries, but certainly it's having a strong effect in Canada. And is that going to be a strong headwind to prevent us from capitalizing on some of these opportunities in front of us? So for me, that's a real watch item as we move forward, whether we get changes to tariffs, whether they, if they're coming and going as they have been, all of that is just kind of fostering this uncertainty environment, which is a real big concern for us.
And so you're effectively saying the answer to the question of when do we feel the impact is we're already feeling the impact because we're seeing that investment start to decline.
Well, certainly there's direct impacts. I mean, of course, there's impacts are going to vary business to business, especially with these 338 tariffs. It really depends on, of course, whether you have that direct exposure to those tariffs. Do you have the ability to diversify your customer base? Are you highly dependent on the U.S. as a destination for your products? Do you have domestic consumers, foreign consumers? So it really just is really going to depend business to business. But those are direct. Those are happening right now. And it's a big issue for sure that we're focusing a lot on, and our efforts are really aligned with the government in terms of just making sure that businesses have the financial flexibility needed, whether it's through additional loans, deferrals, lines of credit, as well as we're pairing, and this is similar again to how other agencies in Canada are operating, we're pairing that with advisory and economic and thought leadership support as well. But those are direct impacts. But it's that longer term concern, that longer term scarring. We've heard a little bit from Spirits Canada as well about that potential scarring that there could be for demand for U.S. liquor on the shelves. There can be potentially that scarring in terms of uncertainty and how that lingers and affects investment in the agri-food space too. So I think there's the short-term direct impacts. There's the indirect impacts through integrated supply chains, higher input costs, which are also a bit more immediate. But there's also these longer-term impacts, which I think we're going to have to really be careful as we watch that and try to support that as we move forward and recover from this.
And Joe, what are the impacts on U.S. agriculture? I think we often know that U.S.-China relations kind of dominate the news, but Canada is an important buyer for U.S. agriculture products. How likely is this to actually have an impact that's noticed across U.S. ag?
Yeah, no, I think for sure. I mean, these are selective tariffs, with Canada. But I mean, if you look, I mean, unfortunately, we're looking at a lot of countries right now where we've imposed tariffs, right? And so, and the differential effects. I mean, Craig mentioned the uncertainty. I think for importers and other sorts of things, the sourcing on these things, I was in a meeting the other day, and I did exactly. you're rattling off of all the trade authorities and all that. I asked what was the tariff on this item, and no one had a clue. I mean, these are people who should have a clue, but it's like everyone's kind of scurrying, looking at their laptops to see what the latest is, and I think that's a real problem. As far as supply chains, absolutely. We're talking about an integrated North American market on cattle. I mean, you can see the problems the U.S. has had. I mean, this has nothing to do with trade actions, but really a SPS issue with feeder cattle from Mexico on the one hand, but that restricts 6% or so of our feeder cattle supply, and we've had very, very high prices on beef. I think that these are real concerns, and obviously with feed ingredients and things like that going north, but a lot of the processed products and other sorts of things that are really critical for a lot of the groceries and grocery stores and other manufacturers as inputs. Those are big concerns, and I think Canada is a huge partner of the U.S. and I think integrated in ways that aren't. I mean, I think people often focus on the bulk commodities, that gains all the attention. Whereas with Canada, these are intermediate products that are coming in, and consumer-ready products that are coming in, and those are felt. I think that the administration obviously has a lot of inflationary or concerns about inflation, so they've been trying to exempt. They've come back in and exempt a lot of ag products, and so be careful about what they're levying tariffs on. But yeah, I think there's a real concern here.
And so I want to come back to the value-added processing, but Joe, I guess I have to ask, do you think USDA recommended a 300,000 ton import tariff on beef to offset some of those pressures? Do you think that
Yeah, no,
actually happen?
I suspect they didn't. It's interesting. Well, it'd be interesting to see how much is actually brought in over 90 days. But yeah, no, I think that's true with a lot of these trade agreements. These trade actions. I don't think the typical players that would have been involved when we were doing trade negotiations back in the mid 80s, or excuse me, mid 2000s or so, in Geneva and elsewhere, where we had USDA experts there could say, here's what we're concessions we want from this country or whatever. I mean, I think there's some of that, but yeah, some of these trade decisions that have been made suggest to me that USDA isn't in the room.
All right. So Craig, Joe talked about kind of the different nature of the trade in the North American context. How do you kind of approach thinking through what the impacts are and modeling some of these things out? And one of my go-to examples of a unique sector is the bakery goods sector, where we've got a fairly significant trade surplus with the United States. I think that surprises people that we're a North American bakery superpower. We probably don't appreciate that often enough. It's been avoided, spared from tariffs so far, but what's your thought around kind of modeling out the impacts and getting down into really understanding what are the sectors that are vulnerable and where those direct impacts that you referenced are?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've looked closely at the direct impacts of the 338 tariffs here at FCC, and we've estimated that around of the total in terms of Canadian dollars, the 28 billion in terms of exports that are exposed, we see approximately about 3.5 at least of ag and food exports that are directly impacted by the 338 tariffs. Alcohol would be the number one. This is, we're talking about 1.3 billion in terms of export dollars being sent annually to the United States. Flours and bulbs, mixes and doughs. We've got the protein isolates, of course, dairy. We have syrups. Fortunately, maple syrup is so far exempt, but of course, honey as well. As we've heard some anecdotes about the impacts in terms of some businesses that rely almost solely on the U.S. market for a destination for its products. So we've gone through, and I'm saying these at a relatively aggregated level. I mean, we all know the HS code level detail here that you can dive a little bit deeper on, and we've done that work to kind of roll up to that 3.5 billion. So those are the direct impacts. That does not include potential indirect impacts or the retaliatory measures, or it also does not include the support programs that are put in place too. So there's a really big picture here, a very, as economists like to call it, general equilibrium view here. There's a lot of factors that are contributing, but that's just the direct impact of the 338 tariffs. Now, in terms of value-added manufacturing, I mean, this is this is a piece where, Canada sends about, 3/4 of its agri-food products to the United States. It's a huge vulnerability right now in terms of exposure to tariffs. And so we're really focusing on how can we diversify those products. We've also identified a very low-hanging fruit opportunity of $12 billion to diversify those products. And that's through a couple strategies of a little bit more interprovincial trade, but really identifying some alternative markets where we have the capability of exporting these products. They're not as constrained from perishability constraints. There's demand in other products. We have free trade agreements with these countries. So, if you kind of layer on those Venn diagrams, you can see some opportunities that are out there that are low-hanging fruit for our sector to diversify, grow, but as well, hopefully we get some, we get past this and we continue to work with the United States to support our sector, because we have value, benefited immensely from the trade relationship with the United States. So we shouldn't ignore that fact for decades and decades. And I made that point already. We shouldn't abandon and ignore that fact. And hopefully we can get past that. But at the same time, it's really important we pursue efforts to diversify to other markets.
Oh, Shaun, we can't hear you. Let Shaun turn his mic on. No, we can't hear you yet either. No, so again, we'll give Shaun a minute to get that figured out. Joe, where do you think that this goes? What's your sense of kind of how things are playing out inside the administration in Washington and what comes next?
Yeah, I would like to echo, I guess, what was said earlier. I'm guardedly optimistic that this I would be kind of in the same camp as Al and Cal before, talking about this being fairly short-lived, but who knows? I mean, and who knows how, if there is a resolution, how long that lasts. I mean, at least with the current administration. I mean, I think that we're now talking, the newspapers today were full of, are we going to have a tit for tat with China again? After having gone through a pretty ugly trade war last year. So I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't know what the longer term impacts of this are. I mean, I agree with Greg. I mean, I think that the U.S. industries involved know how valuable this trade relationship is. We've had trade disputes since the late 80s or prior to that, but certainly since the U.S.-Canada agreement was first put together. But they get resolved for the most part, and that this has been a very productive arrangement with Canada continuing to be near, if not our top market, our number 2 market. So for exports and clearly on imports as well, number 1. So.
No, we can't hear you. Nope, we can't hear you either, Shaun. Don't know. We heard you earlier. Something the gremlins are in. But again, I think we get into this world, Craig, maybe just picking up on kind of this piece around uncertainty and unpredictability and what this looks like. What's your kind of sense as to is there a natural sense when you look at the potential impacts of the way this is going of when the impacts start to escalate? Like, do we get to a point where we can suffer some uncertainty for three months, or businesses can manage direct impacts, and then we get into 2027 and we get kind of past a point? How do you think about what this looks like and how this plays out?
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations this week with other chief economists at Crown corporations in Canada and private organizations, and we're kind of aligned on the mind in terms of the aggregate GDP impact right now is not going to be as large as what it was concerned to be back in Liberation Day, or what we would concern it to be if those auto tariffs come January 1st come into place. So there will be a negative hit to the Canadian economy, but it's going to be what the Bank of Canada or economists generally would view would be a modest hit. It wouldn't push us necessarily into recession, but it is these business to business impacts that are very concerning, and some businesses can be immensely impacted by this. And so that's really the focus of our attention, is trying to identify those and think about how best we can support those businesses. Now, look, I mean, in terms of the impacts, again, I think the direct impacts right now, again, are going to be those business to business impacts that are directly exposed. It's going to be thinking about how exposed am I to the supply chain impacts that possibly are taking place as well right now. One thing that I'm keeping an eye on, as I've mentioned already, the bond market in the United States, but it's also inflation. So inflation in Canada has actually come back down to around core levels of 2%. In the United States, they remained elevated. 3.4% is the recent reading. This is going to put inflationary pressures within both economies, but for sure within the United States with an already elevated inflation level for various reasons. At the same time, of course, affordability will become increasingly more and more of a point of concern as well with as the longer this takes place. I think if I was going to zoom out, we've already talked about investment, but another one that I really want to talk on, which is also obviously connected to all of this, is really just the prolonged period that this takes place between Canada and the United States. Other countries are expanding their presence in other really important agriculture and food markets around the world. And the North American hub that we've, again, kind of established over decades here, benefiting strongly through, supported by free trade agreements or strong trade relationships between Canada and the United States and Mexico, of course, as well, have benefited us immensely in terms of capturing that market share. And I'm really concerned also about some scarring, the deterioration that might take place there the longer that this trade dispute unfolds. So it's a long answer to your question, Tyler. There's a lot of direct impacts, indirect impacts, and then there's these kind of unfortunate, persistent impacts that I think we'll need to be watching really carefully on the investment side, on the global market share side as well.
Tyler?
Yep, good.
Oh, I'm back. Joe, I got a question for you about, I had a mutual friend of ours, Jim Wiesmeyer from Wiesmeyer's Perspective podcast on our radio show earlier this week. And we were talking about, typically what would happen is Canada would lobby members of Congress that were very pro-free trade, the governors, and try to find friends that way to leverage that relationship to influence some of the trade negotiating team in the White House. Is that an effective strategy in the current environment?
Oh, I think you still do it for sure. How effective it is relative to how it's effective in, say, 10 years ago, I think is it's certainly less effective, I think, right now. I mean, I don't know. The frustration I have is I'm not sure what's driving a lot of these trade decisions that are being made. Frankly, I mean, it clearly, if you just look at in general the tariffs and then the uses of trade remedy laws and other sorts of things, I think there's certainly an environment now, or a perceived environment, that, hey, you got a problem, come in the door. We're more than happy to take on an issue. And whereas in the past, I think there was a threshold that, a domestic industry would go to the White House or go to Commerce or whatever and say, hey, we were thinking of there was a higher bar, I think, to bring a case, the AD, CVD type case. Now it's like, renegotiating that USMCA. Let's go after seasonal tariffs. Let's do this. Let's do, and I think the good news is I think a lot of ag groups realize that that's not a good idea, and that they were very instrumental in the last Trump administration of sort of beating down some of those tendencies. But that's who I think you need to hear more from domestic constituents like ag industry to really come forward and say to their congressman, to the White House, saying this is not good for us right now. I mean, it seems to have very little effect, and maybe that's what your conversation with Jim was saying. But I feel like so many of these pro-trade commodity groups in the U.S. have just been, almost afraid to say too much or to be too vocal. And of course, that's, again, I mentioned this moral hazard. I think if you're turning around and saying, hey, you're going to get killed by these tariffs on China, but don't worry, we got all this money coming to you. That's when you're talking about putting a lot of money out into the farm economy to try to ban, to uh, uh, help farmers or mitigate those losses, that keeps voices quieter than they might be otherwise.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense.
And so maybe just to wrap up with Craig and Joe, I'm curious, kind of when you think about all of the uncertainty and all of the challenges that are there, the things that we know that we don't know, how much of an impact will what's happening now have on U.S. agriculture, Canadian agriculture in 2027? Is this something that is going to have an impact, or is your sense that by the time we get to next year, we'll be back to more of that normal? Joe, why don't you go first with what this means
Boy,
for
I'd
you?
like to think we'd be back to a more normal thing. I don't know how long. I mean, I fear that it might take another election cycle to kind of get back to the full thing. I think there are voices within the White House that are just, constantly sort of, looking to the north and thinking that that's somehow an enemy. And I don't, it just is so foreign, frankly, to, the last, most of my, certainly most of my time in government, where it's a very weird place to be. But hopefully we will be back. I think trade is very important. The economy is very important. I think I agree wholeheartedly with Craig that inflation is a big concern, and that at least speaks to a lot of these guys. So hopefully they'll, we'll get back to something more normal.
And Craig, are we going to feel an impact in Canadian ag in 2027?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with what Joseph said. I mean, it's a lot of it hinges critically on what happens next, right? And these kinds of things are difficult to predict. The details, the timing. I think Al said it well. You can't predict both. I mean, I don't know if I'd try to predict either one, but I'm hopefully optimistic that something gets resolved, just due to the importance. Of course, I've mentioned this already. Just due to the importance of the integrated supply chains and the ability to move primary products, value-added products back and forth across the border. It's beneficial to both economies. So I hope that we get to a point where we can be at that level. Now, look, the impact, hey, it's going to vary significantly business to business. And unfortunately, there's going to be supply chain impacts from the tariffs that have been imposed to date. So I think if I'm a business and I'm offering a recommendation, it's really, I think a first step is really try to know your exposure and then move from there to try to have those conversations with your suppliers, your customers, or, it really depends on where you are in the supply chain and your business, but know your exposure, have those conversations, and really try to focus on what you can control for the foreseeable future. In terms of the immediate impacts, again, move forward with that diversification strategy, trying to diversify as much as possible to try to gain additional value above and beyond in other markets, as well as a key longer-term strategy moving forward.
Tyler, we've been talking about these negotiations relative to today's issues, but there's additional things that I think in 27 are going to be, and maybe the rest of the year, that are going to be taking on a lot of the agricultural narrative on trade. For example, if you look at, the U.S. is trying to have a skinny farm bill passed, and the Senate Ag Committee vote 17-6 was, to have a WTO compliant version of MCOOL.
Yeah.
And so that, brought forward by Senate Leader Thune, which is very significant. Obviously, when it gets to conference, we'll see if it actually ends up in the final bill. But a 17-6 vote, bipartisan, is a pretty strong message. And added on top, if we talked about this 300,000 metric ton of beef, that's adding fuel to this is why the U.S. needs MCOOL, because all this cheap Brazilian beef that's coming in. And so that's an issue which we haven't even discussed today, that is going to become very much a part of this ag trade discussion that's outside of these current negotiations.
Yeah, clearly there's lots on the horizon, and we could keep going, but we are a little bit over time already for a webinar. I really want to take the time to say thank you to Craig and to Joe for trying to bring this together at the end, talking about some of this. Again, I understand that economists are sometimes reluctant to make some big predictions, but I think you've given us both some very good insights that are useful to our discussion. So thank you to Craig, thank you to Joe, thank you to Al and Cal and Lisa as well for taking things off. And Shaun, maybe I'll hand it over to you for some concluding remarks after I say, again, please do go to the CAPI website, the Real Ag website, sign up for our newsletters, and hopefully I will see everyone in October at the CAPI conference. You can go to our website to find out more. But Shaun, over to you to wrap things up.
Yeah, I think all of our panelists today provided some very, very good perspectives. I think, it feels like it's a little bit of a dark day here right now in terms of where things are at. I heard some commentary from former USTR ag negotiator Greg Dowd this morning. He's going to be appearing on U.S. Farm Report this weekend. And I liked his tone. It was encouraging. It's like, as mentioned, we've been through this before. All negotiations kind of go sideways. At the end of the day, these are very integrated, even though there is dairy issues between Canada and the U.S. The second largest customer for U.S. dairy products is Canada. Number one is Mexico. So even on dairy, this agreement is absolutely critical for the economic, the economics of agriculture. And so I think we got to just really keep that in mind. And I think there's also what I'm seeing different from the NAFTA renegotiations and talking to a lot of people in U.S. agriculture. At this stage, I think you can maybe call it sympathy. I don't know how the best way to put it. There's a bit of a window of opportunity here for Canada to leverage the walking away from the table and how it's being perceived even in the U.S., where it's like, man, these are some like pretty outlandish demands. What are we doing here? And I think that's an opportunity for Canada to kind of forge ahead. I don't know how you exactly do that, but it is a little bit of a different reaction in the U.S. to these talks versus the NAFTA renegotiations. If we think back to 2017-18, but really appreciate everybody joining us here today. We're going to continue throughout the next, every month having these CAPI Real Agriculture Policy webinars. And like Tyler said at the beginning, we put this together very, very quickly. So we appreciate the panelists opening up their schedule to make this all possible. If you have any feedback, you can send it to shaney@realagriculture.com and we'll get back to as much as we can. And appreciate everybody joining us here today.
Thank you all.